Gods were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that who you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here, he is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell he is risen from the dead. Tell his disciples he is risen from the dead, as he said. Go ahead. He's gone ahead of you to Galilee. He is risen." He arose. Low in the grave he lay. Jesus, my Savior, waiting to come the day. Jesus, my Lord, and up from the grave he arose with the mighty triumph in his soul. He arose the victor from the dark domain, and he lives forever with his saints to reign. He arose, hallelujah, Christ arose. Our pastor, Reverend Dr. Timothy Lake.
Thank you all for joining us for another Bible study session at Union Baptist Church. I want to get right into it. We're going to pick back up off where we left from last week when we were talking about the first part of chapter 5 of Mark. And so I'll remind you that in Mark's gospel, we are seeing Jesus on the move around the region of Galilee, and he's progressively moving outside of that area and making his way to Jerusalem, where he's ultimately going to end up confronting the authorities there. And so we see Jesus growing in popularity. The crowds are gathering around him, and his reputation is preceding him in many ways, and the crowds are matching the growth of his reputation. He is healing, he is forgiving of sins, he is performing miracles in the synagogues, and he is teaching all along the way. And as he's doing all of these, he is increasingly coming under the suspicion of the Jewish authorities for transgressing the Sabbath customs, for blaspheming against the Holy Spirit, against God, by claiming authority that is given to God to himself. And so he is increasingly becoming, the plot has already been initiated to bring him down, and Jesus is still pressing on anyway. His family have greeted him with certain suspicion, and they have joined the rumble of the crowds. They have, at least on one occasion, sought to restrain him, to bring him in from the madness of the crowd, but he has continued to press on. So we see Jesus moving from both place to place, and here in chapter 5, he has landed in the region of the Gerasenes, and so he has been confronted by the demoniac, and he has cast out the thousands of the legions of demons, demonic spirits that have possessed this man who was living among the tombs, and Jesus has sent those spirits into the swine, the herd of swines, and we talked about that. And those swines have gone over the cliff, and Jesus has been pressed to leave the area, and the man who is now in his right mind, is telling the story, is proclamating the good news about Jesus. And then we find here in the 21st verse, which is where we're going to pick up on today's reading. So Matthew 21, and we're going to read through the end of the chapter there. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he said he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome in amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. And I want to say a word about what the text is saying about the context of what Jesus is doing here. So we see here that Jesus is moving about from place to place, and he's performing miracles and healings, but primarily he is also teaching. So Jesus is not just using the occasion of the crowd gathering around him for their own desires to be fulfilled, for their own healings to come about, but he's using this as an occasion to teach. So what we see in Mark in particular is a Jesus who is teaching all the way. A note that we should consider about Jesus in the way in which Jesus would have been understood in the time would have probably, according to the scholars, Jesus would have been understood mostly as a teacher and not so much as the Messiah. I'm talking about during the time of his ministry, his active ministry. Jesus would have probably been understood as a teacher. That's why you see so many references in the text to rabbi and teacher and people calling him rabbi and the disciples looking towards him as a teacher. And so that it's not altogether clear that the disciples themselves, the people who Jesus called out among them, we normally get the idea that those 12 were grown men with gray beards and strapping middle-aged men. But there is a great body of evidence to suggest that those 12 who were called by Jesus were probably teenagers. In the scripture tells us that Jesus was about 30 years old when he started his public ministry, so there would have been a significant age gap between Jesus and those disciples. And Jesus being 30, that's at the age in which teachers begin to take on disciples. As a matter of fact, the word disciple itself really means one who is being taught or a learner, one who is studying, a kind of an apprentice. And so the idea of Jesus calling these disciples, he is calling out individuals who would have been beyond the age of primary, what we would call secondary education in our day. So that in the Jewish tradition, pupils, lads, entered into their educational process somewhere between 4 and 5 years of age when they would start to their education. And then they would go on through a kind of formal educational process that would take them all the way until they were about 12 years old. So from anywhere between 5 and 12, they would have started their educational process. After 12, if you had somebody who was particularly ambitious and had talent and skill, they could go on to be discipled. And so advanced education at that time was actually discipleship. And discipleship meant that you would spend a period of time living and moving about and learning from a teacher, so that people who were of an age, and that would have been about 30, where you could take on disciples, you would be taking on these teenagers who exhibit a certain kind of skill and talent. There is a kind of class dimension there. So you also had to have the resources to be able to go and study under someone, because there was no free lunch, all right? There was no free campus dormitory experience. So you had to have the ability to provide those resources necessary for your livelihood as you were studying, so that the parents of young people who were given over to these teachers would provide the resources for the care of their children over that extended period of time. And so that period of time would be somewhere between 12 and 18 years. So by the age of 12 to about 18, when the Jewish tradition allowed you to be considered to be married, to actually start on taking on adulthood and adult status in the community. So anywhere between 12 and 18. So most of those disciples that were being called out around in that age, and they were being called out to be discipled, to be tutored, and to go through about a 6-year period of discipleship with the teacher, who in this case is Jesus. There is something to note, because you'll probably say to yourself, well, what about Peter? Because we know Peter was already married at the time when Jesus called. We know this because in the text in Luke and other places in the Gospels, we know that Jesus goes to Peter's house, and Peter's mother-in-law is there, and heals her. She's not feeling well, he heals her, and then he goes out, and then she goes to serve them. So we know that Peter is already married and is the head of a house. And so some of the other disciples, maybe Matthew may have been a little older at the time, but even if you hold for the fact that Peter was married, it's probably still clear that Peter was somewhat less younger than Jesus. So Peter could have been married at the age of 18, so he could have been somewhere between 18 and 20 years old. It's not so much clear about Matthew because he was a tax collector, so he was already engaged in a profession. It's hard to tell from the evidence left in the Jewish tradition how old you would have to be a tax collector. There was still a period of apprenticeship for professional or sort of career goals. So Matthew could have been apprenticed to as a tax collector from the age of 12 or so, and by the time Jesus encountered him, or he encounters Jesus, he could have just been starting his career as a tax collector. So he could have been somewhere around 18 or 19 years old too. There is a gap in age between Jesus and the disciples. So what we're talking about is young people who are engaged with, eager to learn, who are excited about the world and excited about the possibilities of new knowledge and new experiences. And those are the people. This is the kind of character, this is the kind of age demographic that Jesus is appointing around him as a part of his intimate circle. I know this is probably, a shock because we see the images of the disciples and they're all older men and they're all mature, but they wouldn't have been the age of Jesus. I only bring this up because as a way of thinking about how recognizable Jesus would have been, even in the group, right? So we made a point of pointing out about Jesus' reception when he alighted on shore, and the demoniac sees him and immediately identifies Jesus. We know that some of this has to do with that the third chapter where Jesus heals the man and tells him to not go out and spread the news, but immediately he goes out, we read in the text, and starts telling about what happened to him and the miracle that had been performed for him through Jesus. And so Jesus, as we read in the text, that Jesus' fame started to spread because of these healings that he had performed. So there is a sense that Jesus' reputation is going before him. But remember that this is not the time of the instant camera, or where people were taking selfies and then, passing them on. So even if Jesus' fame would have been spread, Jesus' image would not have been going ahead of him in the way in which we are now in the media age. And so that Jesus' reputation, so you still have the issue of Jesus, moving from place to place in boats and then alighting from the boats onto the shore, and people immediately identifying him as the Jesus of the reputation. Well, part of that is that Jesus would have been identified because Jesus would have been probably visually older than the people who he was traveling with. I say probably because I remember when I first started teaching at the university, at the college, and I was often mistaken for one of my students, so that I would come into the classroom ahead of the students, and the students would start to file in, and everyone would look around at the time of the class that the class is supposed to begin, and they would look around, ask, who's the teacher? Because they assumed that I was near their age or close to their age, but I wasn't. Right? So in that sense, that Jesus could have been older, but yet still reflected a kind of an identification in terms of visually with the people he was traveling with. But it could be that there was a distinction between the two. And so that we tend to think about these disciples and characterize them and judge them as if they are full-fledged, fully mature, fully developed individuals, although people develop at a different age back in the ancient world than we do now. So now that being said, let's turn to the text. So what we do is we slow down the text a bit and we look at what is going on here. I want to read this text in the way in which we read the first half of this chapter. So I want us to think about the structure of the text, the way the story is being told, the narrative arc of the text. So we have to really pay close attention to follow the narrative in this way. So what do we have here? We have, again, like the story of the demoniac, we have here a story that begins, and then a story then a narrator who interrupts the story and gives and inserts a whole nother story within the story, as if this is a backdrop, if this is background information that is inserted early on into the narrative, and then picks back up on the narrative, the initial story, later on. So what we have here in terms of the narrative arc, we have Jesus coming to shore. That's the location. Jesus is being geographically located. And then immediately the main character in the story, that we assume is the main character of the story, comes out to meet Jesus. And that is Jairus. We are told he is the leader of the synagogue. And he comes out and he provides what it will be the main theme, the main point, the central drama of the story is that his daughter is sick, right? And that he wants Jesus to go with him to his home. If Jesus would just lay hands on the daughter, he knows she would be made well. So that's the theme, that's the drama of the story. That's what we get in the opening opening verses. So from verse 21 to 24, we get the context. The main story is what? Jesus has entered a new place. This man who is a leader of the synagogue, not one that is known to have been committed himself to the life of Jesus or following Jesus. But he's coming for a particular request. His daughter is sick and he wants her to be healed. And then the text breaks off. The narrative breaks off and we get this story about a woman. Right? So the context is, it seems like it's an intimate request. This individual who has some kind of presence in the community comes to meet Jesus, and they head off to this man's house. And then all of a sudden, the story breaks off, and we get a sense of the larger scope of the scene, the larger scope of the scene. So our view expands. We have a kind of narrow view of Jesus in this conversation with a man, and then the view expands, and what we get is we see a large crowd that is there. And they are pressing up against Jesus. This is starting at at the B side, the B part of verse 24. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in. So they are on their way. This crowd presses in, stops Jesus. This is why Jesus pauses. This is why Jesus is halted on his way from this personal, private kind of mission that he goes on. He's halted and he is confronted with the masses, right? The masses slow him up from getting to his destination. And it says a large crowd followed him and pressed in, and in verse 25, there was a woman. A new storyline. A new storyline picks up. There was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians. She had spent all that she had. She didn't get any better. As a matter of fact, she got worse. She had heard about Jesus, right? She had heard about Jesus, and she came up from behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. And then she said to herself, if I would but touch his clothes, I will be made well. And immediately she felt inside of herself that she was made well. So this story that is inside the story is doing some kind of work. And the question is, what work is this story doing? Because we can take this whole story about the woman with the hemorrhage out of the narrative itself, out of this story, and we would have a complete story. So this injection of this story about this woman in this particular narrative is doing something. It's meant to tell us something about the narrative itself, about the whole story itself. I want to suggest that the way we get at this is that we pull the story out. We pull the story of the woman out of this larger story, and we read these two stories simultaneously. So we read the story that is embedded within the story about the woman. The story about the woman is embedded into this larger story about Jairus and his daughter. That's really the story, right? The larger story is about Jairus and his daughter. The inserted story is this woman with the hemorrhage. So if we take these two stories and we read them simultaneously, I think we start to understand what the whole story is telling us. Something about Jesus. So let's try to do that. You have to follow along. All right. So we're going to take these two stories out. So if we take these two stories out and we read them side by side, what do we have? So in verse 21, right, we have a great crowd is gathered around Jesus. In verse 21, if we think about this, so this is the Jairus story, right? So a great crowd is gathered around Jesus, right? A great crowd has gathered around him. In verse 24, the B part, we also see a great crowd gathered around, right? So in the inserted story, we talk about a great crowd. There's two great crowds gathered around. But if we move towards the story of the little girl, so when Jesus, Jairus' daughter, when we get to the story of Jairus' daughter, we get on verse 20. This is verse 38, right? Verse 38, we get, when Jesus came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. Oh, wait a minute. So in the crowd that is gathered around Jairus' house, right, is different than the crowd that is gathered around Jesus when this woman is going to press in on him, right? So this crowd is pressing in on Jesus. They are stopping Jesus. They are hindering Jesus' movement. They are blocking his way, if you will. They are slowing him down. But when he gets to Jairus' house, he confronts a crowd, and what are they doing? They are in a great commotion, right? The text tells us they're in a great commotion. And what are they in a commotion? Doing in this commotion? They are weeping and they are wailing. Right? They are weeping and they're wailing loudly. Two different crowds. One crowd, you see pain and anguish, right? Lamentation, mourning. The other crowd, what do you have? Desire, right? You have anxiety. You have a pressing in, right? An eagerness, eagerness to it, an urgency to it. We have a crowd that is barricading Jesus on the way, right? So Jesus is inhibited in going forward because the crowd is pressing in. On this one, the crowd is in their own grief. Right? They're in their own grief. And Jesus is not pressed to move while this crowd is in their own grief. Jesus can move while people are in their own grief. There's no hindrance there. He's in his own. They're on their own grief and they're doing whatever they do when they grieve. And Jesus can weave his way through freely, right? And so the question is, so what happens in the crowd with the woman with the issue? There is a question asked. Jesus asked, "Who touched my clothes?" This is verse 30. Who touched my clothes? In the other story, right, that I'm reading as the other story, verse 39, there is also a question asked, right? The question asked is, why do you make this commotion? Why are you weeping? Two questions. One, who touched me? Who touched my clothes? The other question is, why are you weeping? weeping? What's all of this weeping that's going on? Why are people mourning? If you think about these two questions, right, they are coming from Jesus, right? These are two questions of Jesus seeking information from the crowd, right? Who touched me? What is going on here? Why is this weeping and wailing? There is a response to both of these questions. The response that Jesus gets to the who touched me comes from the disciples. And this is verse 31, where they say to him, you see this crowd pressing in. Why would you say, who touched my clothes? You see this crowd. Don't you see what's going on? Can't you apprehend this scene? A kid could understand this, right? An infant can understand, not an infant, okay. A young person can understand this, what is going on here. But you're asking the obvious. You're asking the obvious. In the other one, Jesus, the response is what? Verse 40. The response is laughter, right? They laugh at him. They laugh at Jesus. Jesus asked the question, why are you weeping? This child is not dead, but sleeping. And what do? They laugh at him. They laugh at him. So it is almost the same response, right? For them, it's a ridiculous question. Right? We're mourning because the person has died. You're asking us who touched your clothes in a crowded scene. It's the same kind of, it's generating the similar kind of response, the obvious, right? So then if we move down to the story, what Jesus' response to their response in the first story with the hemorrhage lady, Jesus' response is in verse 32. So Jesus' response in 32 is, he looked all around to see who had done it. So Jesus looks around for the evidence. He zones in close himself. He tries to assess the scene, right? To see if he can suss out who has touched him, right? He looks around. He peers into it. He tries to get his evidence. In the other story, in verse 41, in the story of Jairus' daughter, what does Jesus do? He says he took her by the hand, right? Well, in verse 40, he says they laughed, and he says then he put them out, right? And then he put them out and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. So where Jesus tries to peer into the crowd, right, tries to assess what's going on in the crowd, tries to separate, to disaggregate the crowd with his vision and his reason, to be able to point out the source, right? Jesus does something similar in this response. What does he do? He says, okay, who are the immediate people who need to be concerned here? So he puts the naysayer, the kind of hangers-on, the kind of people who really aren't essential to the story, right? He puts them out in order to call out the essential drama, the central participants in the drama, right? He says these identify specific people. You all come, right? Everybody else stay out. Jesus is doing assessment. What's essential to make this story? He's doing the same thing. I read it that way. And then so Jesus says, and then what happens in verse 28, and the woman with the issue. All right, so verse 27 and 28. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. So that's the response there. If we read what Jesus said, what happened in the story about the little girl, starting with verse 41, what happens? He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, get up. And get up. So what happens is, the lady with the issue, right, we are told that she did what? She came up from behind Jesus, and then she touched his clothes. With the story from the little girl, Jesus goes directly to her, right, and grabs her hand, right? And so and then speaks to her, right? And then the healing happens, right? So one is Jesus takes the initiative right to the girl, right? He is initiating all of the action. Jesus goes directly to her, takes her hand, and speaks the words, and she is healed. The other one is through clandestine means, right? She goes around the back way, right? She sneaks in. She comes under a kind of cloak and dagger thing, right? She susses her own way in, right? No clear direction towards Jesus, but she has a plan that, if it's executed properly, will get her to where she's going, right? And instead of touching Jesus physically, she touches Jesus' clothes. So let me stop. So we have two different directions, two different paths to the same end, which is healing, right? So two different ones. One, Jesus goes first, the other one, the lady takes the initiative serendipitously, right? And then and then Jesus, what happens next? Jesus says in verse 29, so then the reaction. Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And then verse 30, right? Jesus, immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched me?" So you have this idea that Jesus that the hemorrhage stopped, right? And her disease is healed, that she has suffered for 12 years. 12 years. All right. So in verse 42, and it says, "And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years old." 12 and 12. Right? So there is a parallel between these two women, in the sense that her illness had lasted for as long as the girl has been alive. Right? So that there is an illness that has afflicted this woman for 12 years. This girl is only 12 years old. So you have a parallel with 12 and 12. And that's, I think, is a clue, a textual clue, that these two stories ought to be read with the purpose of understanding them both at the same time. What's going on with the both of them. And then Jesus, then the lady says to herself that she feels in her body that she has been made whole, right? And that she has been suffering in this way. And then Jesus says something to her. So Jesus spoke to the girl who's sleeping, but they thought she was dead. And Jesus speaks to this woman too. He says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. What he says to the little girl in verse 42, immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. And at this, they were overcome with amazement, and he strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Right? So these two stories end in a significant way. I would suggest that the endings of these stories tell us something too about what is going on in the larger context of the story. So let's talk about the larger context of the story. So one, we see that the beginning of the story, Jesus is being approached by Jairus, and he says that if you touch my daughter, she will be made whole. If you lay hands on her, she will be made whole. This story about the woman doesn't involve Jesus touching at all. Right? So this is a story that says that the healing power that Jesus has to offer is not prerequisite of Jesus touching. Right? It's not prerequisite of Jesus touching you in that way. And then Jesus, what happens in the story, they go off to Jairus' house. And then Jesus is delayed. So if we think about what happens with Jesus goes directly to see about the issue, to go directly to the problem itself. In this case, the woman comes to Jesus. And not straight away, but crooked ways, backward ways, through back channels to Jesus. Right? So the story is, one story says, Jesus will come to see about you. The other one says, make your way to Jesus any way you can. And if you get to Jesus, and when you get to Jesus, you will find the things that you need. The other one says, Jesus will make his way to you. You see, the stories are reading in parallel as an expansion of the total narrative itself. It's not that Jesus has to come to you by himself and on his own initiative, but you can make your way to Jesus. And so that the story is expansive because these stories are intertwined, and they're expanding what it means for Jesus to be in ministry and in the world, right? And so the one where the lady with the issue says that she feels in her body that she was healed, right? Because she thought to herself, right, that if I just touch his garment, I will be made whole. And Jesus says to her, your faith has healed you. Your faith has made you whole. But the larger story of Jairus and the daughter is what? The daughter didn't exhibit any faith, right? We don't read that the daughter had faith that Jesus was going to heal her. It's Jairus, her father's faith, right? That attracts Jesus and sends just Jesus directly towards her. And so the larger story is telling us that the faith of others, right, the faithfulness of others can lead to Jesus performing healing to those who are even dead, right, or even asleep, those whose mouth, right, are not articulating faith. But then the inserted story of the woman is saying what? You, in your own faith, right, in your own heart, in the interiority of yourself, right, can exhibit the requisite faith needed to bring healing to you from Jesus, right? Faith in Jesus. So it's a story within a story that says, oh, no, it's not just about, any own faith, but it's the faith of others, right? That Jesus performs miracles out of the faith of others, directed to those who are not necessarily expressing faith. I think the lesson there is for us, right? So that when we are in a situation, and we're living our lives, and we're thinking, well, that has nothing to do with me. What that person is going through doesn't really have anything to do with me. Or that really doesn't speak to my issue. And Jesus may have performed that for them, or God may have intervened on their behalf. But what about my particular situation? So Jesus can actually come to your rescue from any particular angle and from any faith position. Because the lesson is that if we have faith, like Jairus had faith, Jesus will perform. God will perform miracles in the world. In a world that is not necessarily faithful. So the faithlessness of the world, right, can be upended by the faithfulness of those who believe. And so that you can press your way in. And then reading the story in this kind of larger way, we come to the idea of the two different crowds, right? And the responses of the crowd, of the people in the crowd. So what is going on there? Why does the disciples in one story speak to Jesus' question in a way that seems to be a little challenging, if not disrespectful, right? That says, don't you see the obvious? Aren't you the teacher? Aren't you supposed to be smarter than us? I can read this situation, and you're asking me who touched you? And in the other situation, the crowd is, starting to laugh at Jesus. Can't you see why people are mourning? This is mourning. That we're mourning because somebody has died. And Jesus says what to them? Right? That to the disciple, what Jesus does is turns to the crowd and looks for himself. Right? So Jesus looks for himself. In that gaze, when Jesus gazes out at the crowd, asking the question, who did it? Come forth, confess. Right? Bring your truth to me. Right? The woman is compelled to come out. Right? And what does the text say? She told him the whole truth. It didn't say she told him, you made me whole, or this crowd was against me, or whatever. It said she told him the whole truth. So that what Jesus is wanting is the whole truth of the situation. The whole truth of the situation is what God can do in the world. Not what the world is doing or what is happening in the world. So what the disciple was saying to Jesus, don't you see what's happening in this moment? This is the truth. This is the reality. People are pressing in on you. And Jesus, with the woman coming forth, she tells him the whole truth. The whole truth is that it's not just what's happening here that is all that is going on. What is going on here is God's ability to perform miracles. It's always already at your disposal. And so when the crowd laughs at Jesus at Jairus' house, right? When Jesus says, why are you doing this? And they laugh at him. They are what? Reflecting on what they see. And they're saying, this is obvious. This is what is happening. This is what is real in the moment. And what Jesus says, no, I'll tell you what is real in the moment. That child is sleeping. Right? That child is not dead. You are acting in a way that you have determined what reality is. But only God can determine what reality is. And so Jesus says, the whole truth of it is that you don't know what's going on. That God is doing something and prepared to do something in this world, in this moment, which will amaze you. The text says that they were amazed. And then we come to the final part of reading the story in this way. So we see at the end where Jesus says to the lady with the issue, he calls her daughter. He says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. This is verse 34. So think right there. He says what? Daughter. Right? Daughter. Right? So remember in the other chapter, in chapter 4, where Jesus is at home and the crowd is with Jesus and they're pressing in on his house, and his family gets upset, and they go out, and then they go, and Jesus goes out to talk with the crowd, and somebody comes and gets him and says, your mama and your brother, they want you. And Jesus says, who's my mother? Who's my brother? Those who do my will, they're my mother, they're my brother, right? What Jesus has added here is not only in terms of in terms of mother and brother, but in terms of daughter and son, right? And by extension, son. So he calls her daughter. He has expanded the family tree, if you will, from those who believe just being siblings and parents, right, of God, right, in the lineage of God, but also being offsprings of God. He calls her daughter. He is just as intimate with her as Jairus is with his own daughter, right? So they are on the same terms. These women are on the same terms in the categories in their relationship to the relationship to the men in this story. 12 years, also a marker of their identification. This identification as the daughter of the men in the text is also a marker of their same identification. And so Jesus says to her, go in peace. Now that's a curious thing too. Go in peace. Why did he say go in peace? Why did he say go in peace? Peace? As if there's going to be a threat, or if she should have anxieties, or if there's some kind of issue there. I think this text is saying, and this is my reading of it, you may have a different one. I think what that means, go in peace, means don't let this crowd press in on you. Don't let them press in on you with the urgency and the clamoring for you to explain exactly what happened. Don't let them bother you that way. Don't let them question whether or not you actually had a hemorrhage or you actually were suffering from a disease. Don't let them question whether or not this was a mental illusion of yours or some kind of hypochondriac that you experience or that you manifest hypochondria. No, go in peace. Be at peace, knowing that what has happened to you is proof in of itself of the faith that you hold. Go in peace. Do not be disturbed by this. Go in peace. I think that's what Jesus is saying to her. Go in peace. Don't be alarmed. Don't get all pressed up about it. People are going to come and clamor against you. They're going to ask you to tell what happened, and they want proof and documentation. Don't be disturbed. Don't be rattled by that. Right? Don't be rattled by it. Don't be shaken in your faith because a miracle has happened to you. And you know within your body that you have been made whole. And I think likewise in the Jairus story. What does Jesus say in the Jairus story? It says that they were amazed. And then verse 43, he strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. I think what Jesus is doing here is saying, this is a teachable moment. That what I've done is brought you out away from the crowd, and I brought you into this setting to teach you something. And that this lesson is for you, meaning it's for the disciples, and Jesus is the rabbi, is the teacher, and it's for the parents of this girl who exhibited faith that Christ could actually do what they were asking of him. This is a teachable moment. And what we have been given in this text, in this scripture, is a window into what faith can do. And have been taught a lesson about who Jesus is and how Jesus acts in the world and what we can expect if we exhibit the same faithfulness towards Christ that has happened to this woman with the issue of the hemorrhage, and this girl who was sleeping but thought to be dead, but the faith of her parents made a miracle happen that astounded people. So we have been taught a lesson by reading this story that has a story within the story. And then the last part, the actual final part that I'll say is that Jesus says to them, give her something to eat. Now that's a curious thing. Why would Jesus say that? Why would the story of the little girl coming back end with a declaration or order to give her something to eat? I think that what's going on here is that Jesus is saying, just like he told that lady with the hemorrhage to go in peace, to not be disturbed, do not doubt, do not be self-critical of the situation, go in peace. He's saying, give her food. Because people right away would suspect that what has happened is that she's a ghost. Right? So this lady, this girl who was dead, has now come back. She's a spirit. She's a ghost. But the thing about spirits and ghosts, they can't eat. Right? So only somebody who has corporeal body, who has a body that's in the flesh, that is human, needs sustenance, right? Can take in food and do what the body does with food. So giving her food is our proof that this girl has actually come back to life. Not as a ghost, not as a spirit, but as a human being who has been resurrected, if you will, right? Who has been thought to be asleep, has now come back to life. And the proof of it is, watch her eat. This is no ghost. So the lesson, Jesus solidifies the lesson with the proof of her humanity. And so reading this story that we know so well, but when we slow that down and we break it down in terms of the narrative flow here, I think we learn that what is being said here and taught is a story that unfolds into larger ideas about how we approach God, how we understand who Christ is, and how our faith ought to be enacted in the service towards God. So that's the way I would read it, and then I would open it up for questions and comments at this point. I don't know that we have any.
Mom, you got a question?
No, he answered mine about why he told them not to say anything.
Okay.
All right. Let us look to the Lord with benediction. Oh God, we give you thanks for allowing us to gather as a people. The people who have been called by your name, the people who have been given a fresh burning, the people who have ears to hear, eyes to see, and a heart to feel that you are real in this world, and that there is nothing impossible for you to do. God, we thank you for the story of Jairus and his daughter, and thank you for the story of the woman who pressed her way to Jesus, just to touch his clothes, Lord. We thank you for what these lessons teach us about a life of faith and our ability to approach Jesus, sometimes from the back way. Sometimes Jesus comes straight at us, Lord. And we give thanks for both the back way and the straightward path that Jesus beats towards us when we are in need. Lord, thank you for the prayers of others and the faithfulness of those who have come before us. We know that those prayers still abound now. Say, my mother prayed for me. Thank God she prayed for me. Say, my pastor prayed for me. Had me on his mind. It's at the time to pray for. Let us pray for one another. Because our prayers towards others also yield good fruit when they are done with earnestness and they open the way for Jesus to come into this world, even now, even in this post-resurrection moment. Jesus can make an appearance on the scene and meet our needs. We give you thanks for the glorious power of Jesus. His life lived, his death surrendered, and his miraculous resurrection as we await the return of his coming again.
Yes.
Keep us safe and keep us well and keep us on our knees, praying to thee. In the matchless name of Jesus, who is the Christ, we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you once again. See you next week for us to when we continue to study Mark's Gospel.